They say a parent's love is unconditional, but I learned the hard way that sometimes the condition is the child herself. I found the card on a Thursday afternoon in the back of my daughter's dresser drawer, a birthday card, yellowed at the edges, addressed to a little girl named Sophie, a granddaughter I never knew existed, a child my daughter gave up at birth, ashamed of a limb difference she couldn't bear to face. And the people who raised Sophie 2 states away, the people who kept the secret for 12 years, were the very family she married into. I am 63 years old, and I have spent my entire adult life believing I understood the shape of my family. My daughter was my only child, or so I thought. My wife passed 7 years ago, and since then it has just been me and the occasional Sunday dinner, the birthday phone calls, the comfortable half-truths that grown children and aging parents trade when they want to stay close without getting too close. But that card in her drawer ripped through every assumption I had ever made about who my daughter was and what she was capable of doing. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just a secret. It was a buried life, and I needed to know why. I need to take you back a few steps because what I found in that drawer didn't arrive there by accident. It had been placed there, carefully, inside a small wooden box has had since she was a teenager. The kind of box where she kept old concert tickets and dried corsages, and the things daughters keep when they still believe their fathers can protect them from everything. I had no reason to open it. But that Thursday, I was in her house alone, letting in the plumber to fix a leak under her kitchen sink while she was at work. I walked past her bedroom door and saw the box sitting on her dresser, lid slightly ajar, a corner of pale pink paper peeking out. And something in me, some premonition I still can't name, made me stop. I sat on the edge of her bed, opened the box fully, and there it was, a birthday card. Hand-drawn balloons on the front, the kind a child makes with crayons and too much glue, slightly warped from whatever journey it had taken. Inside, in careful adult handwriting, the words, "To our sweet Sophie on her 8th birthday, we are so proud of the brave, brilliant girl you are. With all our love, Nana and Pop Pop Hale." My hands went cold. I read it 5 times, 6 times, my brain refusing to assemble the pieces into a picture that made any sense. Sophie Hale. The name meant something, but I couldn't place it yet. All I knew was that my daughter had no child. She and her husband James were married 4 years ago, a beautiful wedding on the coast of Maine, favorite place before she got sick. Had never mentioned wanting children. She was 37 now, her career consuming her, and I'd long ago accepted that the grandfather role was a chapter I'd never get to read out loud. So whose 8th birthday card was this, and why was it hidden in my daughter's bedroom like evidence? I put the card back exactly as I'd found it, closed the box, paid the plumber, and drove home in a fog. That night I sat in my recliner, the television playing some game show I didn't watch, and I turned the name over and over, Hale, Nana and Pop Pop Hale. Then it clicked. James's parents were named Helen and Hale. They lived in North Carolina, 2 states south of our home in Virginia. I'd met them twice, once at the engagement party, once at the wedding. Helen was warm, was reserved, and both of them looked at my daughter the way people look at a painting they're still trying to understand. I remembered thinking it was odd, the way Helen's eyes followed around the room, not with affection, but with something closer to vigilance. At the time, I chalked it up to mother-in-law protectiveness. Now, sitting alone with the name Hale written in birthday card ink, that memory felt like a warning I had ignored. I called the next morning, something I rarely did on a Friday. I usually waited for her to call me, respecting the boundaries of a busy adult daughter. Her voice was bright when she answered, the way it always was, and I almost lost my nerve. We talked about the weather, about the plumber, about nothing at all. Then I said, casually as I could manage, "I meant to ask, sweetheart, how are James's parents doing? I realize I haven't heard you mention them in a while." The silence on the other end lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it was the longest 3 seconds of my life. "They're fine, Dad," she said finally, her voice now carrying that careful weight people use when they're deciding how much to say. "Why do you ask?" "No reason," I said, "just wondering." She changed the subject. We hung up, and I knew, in the way a father knows when his daughter is lying, that something enormous was being kept from me. I spent the next 2 weeks doing something I'm not proud of, but I'm also not sorry. I became a quiet investigator of my own child's life. I searched Sophie Hale online. Nothing came up. The name, I now understood, was too common and the child too young. I searched Helen and Hale in North Carolina and found an address, a modest house in a town called Mount Airy. I found a local newspaper clipping from 8 years ago. Mount Airy couple welcomes granddaughter, with no photograph, but a brief mention that the child would be raised by them due to unnamed family circumstances. I found an elementary school honor roll listing from the previous spring. Sophie Hale, grade 3, perfect attendance. My hands shook as I read it. My granddaughter was real. She was alive. And she was being raised by people I barely knew, 2 states away. While I had spent the last 8 years watering my tomatoes and missing a person I never knew existed. The question that burned in my chest was not just why, it was how. How had this happened? How had my daughter carried a pregnancy, given birth to a child, surrendered that child, and then 4 years later married into the family that had taken her in? Did James know? Did know the connection when she met him? Or was this some cosmic coincidence so cruel it felt orchestrated by a god with a dark sense of humor? I needed answers, and I needed them from the one person who could give them to me. I drove to house the following Sunday without calling ahead, something I have never done, something my father's manual would have advised against. But I wasn't operating on fatherly wisdom anymore. I was operating on grief and confusion and the slow-burning fury of a man who has been robbed of something he didn't know he had. She opened the door in jeans and an old sweater, her hair pulled back the way her mother used to wear it. She saw my face and knew. I didn't need to hold up the card. I didn't need to say the name Sophie. Her eyes filled with tears before I even stepped inside, and she said, in a voice so small it broke me, "Dad, I need to tell you something." I sat on her couch. She sat across from me, and for the first time in her adult life, my daughter looked at me not as a father she wanted to protect from the truth, but as a man who had already found it. "Her name is Sophie," began. "She's my daughter. She was born 9 years ago, before I met James, before I even moved back to Virginia, and I gave her up because I was ashamed. Not of her, never of her. I was ashamed of myself." I waited. The room was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen 2 rooms away. "She was born with a limb difference," said. "Her right arm didn't develop fully. It's called a congenital amputation. They don't know why it happens, but it does. And when I saw her for the first time, when the doctor placed her on my chest and I saw her tiny body and that arm, I broke, Dad. I broke in a way I have never broken before or since. Not because I didn't love her. Because I looked at her and saw a world that would be cruel to her, and I didn't believe I was strong enough to protect her from it." She was crying now, the tears falling freely, and I wanted to go to her, but my body wouldn't move. I just sat there, absorbing the weight of a secret that had been pressing down on this house for nearly a decade. "I made the hardest decision of my life," she continued. "I put her up for adoption. I chose a family from a registry, a couple in North Carolina who specifically wanted a child with special needs. Their names were Helen, and I didn't know their last name at first. I didn't know where they lived beyond the state. It was a closed adoption. I signed papers. I walked away. I spent the next 3 years trying to forgive myself, and I never did." She paused, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and looked at me with something that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite relief, but lived somewhere in between. "Then I met James at a work conference, and on our 3rd date, he showed me a picture of his parents, Helen and Hale, and I recognized them instantly from the adoption agency photos I'd stared at for months, trying to memorize the faces of the people who would raise my daughter." The world tilted. "You knew," I said, my voice hoarse. "Before you married him, you knew." "I knew," she whispered. "And I married him anyway, because I thought maybe, somehow, Sophie could still be part of my life. Not as her mother, she'll never know that, but as someone who loves her from the edges, as someone who gets to watch her grow up even if from a distance. She stopped talking and I realized she was waiting for me to respond, but I had no words, because what she just described wasn't a secret. It was a wound, still open, that she'd been dressing and redressing for 9 years alone, and I was only now being asked to help her heal it. But there was something else, a darker corner of this story that she hadn't yet illuminated. And when I finally spoke, my voice came out lower than I intended, carrying the weight of everything I still didn't understand. I said carefully, "Does James know the truth about Sophie?" The look on her face answered me before her words did. "He thinks we're just close to his parents. He thinks Sophie is his niece by a distant cousin they took in. He doesn't know she's my daughter. He doesn't know that every time I look at that child, I'm looking at my own flesh and blood." The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall ticked. And I realized in that moment that the secret I had stumbled upon was not just old and buried. It was alive, it was growing, and it was about to tear my daughter's marriage apart. I sat there in her living room, the silence stretching between us like a wire pulled too tight. She had just told me that James, her husband, the man who stood beside her in front of God and 50 guests on that cliff in Maine, had no idea the child his parents were raising 2 states away was his wife's own flesh and blood. He thought Sophie was the daughter of a distant cousin, a sad story with a generous ending. And here was my daughter, my only child, living a double life so elaborate I couldn't decide whether to weep or applaud. Told me everything that afternoon. How she went into labor alone in a hospital in Richmond, terrified and 26 years old, no partner, her mother already gone, me 100 miles away and not someone she could face. How the nurses had been kind, but the looks had started immediately, the pitying glances when they saw Sophie's arm, the gentle suggestions that she might want to speak with a social worker before making any decisions. How the word adoption had been offered not as a tragedy, but as a solution. The agency brochure slid across the bedside table like it was helping. She chose the Hales because their profile specifically mentioned experience with limb differences. Helen had worked as a pediatric occupational therapist before retiring early to raise Sophie. Had grown up with a brother who used a wheelchair. They weren't afraid of difference, the profile said. They welcomed it. And when saw their photograph, Helen with her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical clip, with his kind eyes and Gardner's hands, she told herself she was doing the merciful thing. The selfless thing. She signed the papers 4 days after Sophie was born and walked out of that hospital carrying a folded receiving blanket the nurses had let her keep, the only object she would ever have that smelled like her daughter. 6 months later, she moved back to Virginia to rebuild. 3 years after that, at a logistics conference in Charlotte, she met James Hale, who mentioned his parents lived in Mount Airy and had recently taken in a baby girl under what he described as complicated circumstances. He didn't know the details, he said. He just knew his mother called the child her miracle. Sat across that conference table, her coffee going cold in her hands, and realized the universe had delivered her daughter's address to her on a name tag. I asked her why she went through with it, why she didn't walk away the moment she made the connection. She looked at me with those eyes, her mother's eyes, and said something I will carry until the day I die. Because it was the only way I could ever be near her again, even if she never knows who I am, even if I have to watch her call another woman Nana. I get to see her growing up. I get to hear James talk about how she's doing in school. I get to sit across from Helen at Thanksgiving and know that my daughter is safe and loved and alive. You don't turn your back on that, Dad. Not when it's the only door God ever opens. I understood then, in a way that terrified me as much as it moved me, that my daughter had been living inside a geometry of grief so precise and so private that even her own husband was outside the circle. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake that night staring at the ceiling, was that I didn't know if I could condemn her for it or if I would have done exactly the same thing. The next morning, I made a decision that my fatherly instincts screamed against but my conscience demanded. I called Helen Hale. Not to confront her, not yet. I presented myself as a lonely widower, an aging father-in-law who regretted not knowing his daughter's married family better, who wanted to bridge the distance with a visit. I framed it as nostalgia, as loneliness, as the harmless impulse of an old man with too much time. Helen's voice on the phone was warm, but behind the warmth I detected something I couldn't name at first. Caution, yes, but also a faint note of something else. Anticipation, as though a call she had been expecting for years had finally arrived. I drove down to Mount Airy the following Saturday, my old eating the miles while my mind churned through every possible version of the conversation ahead. Mount Airy is the kind of town where the post office still has a bulletin board and the diner remembers your order. The Hales lived on a quiet road lined with dogwoods, their house a white clapboard with a wraparound porch and a wheelchair ramp leading up the side. I noted the ramp. I noted the way it was integrated into the architecture, not tacked on as an afterthought. These were people who had built their lives around accommodation. Helen met me at the door with fresh lemonade and a handshake that lingered a beat too long. Was in the living room, rising from his recliner with the careful economy of a man whose back gave him trouble. They were gracious, everything you'd want your daughter's in-laws to be. But as I sat in their sunlit kitchen, surrounded by ceramic roosters and framed photographs, I felt the same thing I'd felt on the phone, a coiled readiness. A sense that I was the guest who had finally arrived, not the guest who had surprised them. And there, on the mantelpiece in the living room, was a school photograph of Sophie. She wore a purple sweater and a gap-toothed smile that stopped my heart. Her right arm ended just below the elbow, the smooth skin of the residual limb visible in the short sleeve. She wasn't hiding it. She wasn't posed to minimize. She was just a little girl smiling at a camera, radiating that particular confidence children only have when someone has told them, again and again, that they are exactly who they're supposed to be. I stared at that photograph so long that Helen touched my elbow. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" she said softly. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my throat closing around a grief I hadn't fully let myself feel until that exact moment. I was looking at my granddaughter for the first time, and I was doing it in the home of strangers. We sat down to lunch. Sandwiches, iced tea, the kind of meal that invites conversation without forcing it. I asked polite questions about the town, about woodworking hobby, about how they'd ended up in Mount Airy. They asked about my garden, about whether I'd considered moving closer to now that I was alone. And then, between spoonfuls of coleslaw, cleared his throat and set down his fork with a deliberateness that told me the performance was over. "George," he said, "my name is George. I should have mentioned that earlier. I think we've done enough dancing around while you're really here." Helen's hand went still on her glass, looked at me with those kind eyes, and I saw in them something I recognized because I'd seen it in the mirror after died. The weight of a long-held secret, finally preparing to let itself be lifted. "I know about Sophie," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Told me everything. I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm not here to demand anything. I'm here because my daughter has been carrying something alone that she should never have carried at all, and I'm trying to understand why." Nodded slowly, exchanging a glance with Helen. "We've been expecting this conversation for years," he said. "Ever since James brought home for the first time and we recognized her name from the adoption file. We knew immediately who she was to Sophie. And we made a choice, right then, that I'm not sure we've ever fully justified to ourselves." Helen picked up the thread, her voice then more defensive. "We didn't tell James. We didn't tell that we knew. We just let things unfold. We told ourselves it was to protect Sophie. She'd already been through a relinquishment. If her birth mother suddenly reappeared and the situation became messy, she'd be the one who suffered most. But the truth, George, is that we were also protecting ourselves. We'd fallen in love with that baby. We'd spent 3 years rocking her through fevers and teaching her to hold a crayon with her left hand, and telling her every night that she was perfect. The idea of losing her, or of having the terms of our relationship with her suddenly renegotiated, terrified us. I let that hang in the air. I understood it. That was the awful thing. I could see the humanity in their cowardice, because they weren't villains. They were grandparents who had been handed a miracle and a moral dilemma in the same package, and they had chosen the path that kept their grip on the miracle. But James doesn't know, I said. He still doesn't know. My daughter has been married to your son for 4 years, and he has no idea the child you're raising is his wife's biological daughter. How did that happen? How did that continue? Rubbed the back of his neck. At first, we justified it by saying Sophie was too young. Then we said we were waiting for the right time. Then the wedding happened, and we realized the right time had come and gone, and we'd missed it. And after that, every day without the truth made the truth harder to tell. I think you can understand that, George. I think you know what it's like to defer a hard conversation until the deferral itself becomes a sin. I did know. If there is one thing I have learned in 63 years, it's that the secrets that start as small acts of protection end as architecture. Walls you built so long ago, you no longer remember what you were trying to keep out. I was about to ask another question to press further into the timeline of their decisions when the front door opened. We all turned, and there, standing in the hallway with a book bag over her shoulder and a curious expression on her face, was Sophie. Home early from her eyes went to me first, a stranger in her grandparents' kitchen, then to Helen, then to the table where 4 plates sat, one of them still mostly full. "Nana, who's that?" she asked, direct, unafraid, a child who had never been taught to shrink. Helen's face did something complicated. "Sophie, honey, this is an old friend of mine. His name is George. Why don't you go wash up and I'll come talk to you in a minute?" Sophie looked at me for another beat, and then she smiled. It was smile, my wife's smile, the exact corner tilt and everything. I felt the room tilt with it. "Hi, George," she said. "I'm Sophie, I'm 9. She held up her left hand, the one that was full and perfect, with 9 fingers extended. "Hello, Sophie," I managed. "I'm very glad to meet you." She disappeared down the hallway, and the 3 of us sat frozen, the weight of that ordinary, extraordinary moment pressing down on us. Because in that exchange, one thing had become perfectly clear to me, and I think to Helen and as well. This could not go on. The architecture was cracking. Helen excused herself to go talk to Sophie, and I remained at the table, the sandwiches now forgotten. He stared at his plate for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw in a way it hadn't been before. "There's something else," he said. "Something we haven't told you, something we didn't even tell." I waited. "Sophie knows she's adopted," said. "She's known since she was old enough to understand the word. We never wanted her to grow up with a wall in her own history. But last year she started asking more specific questions, who her birth mother is, whether she looks like her, whether her birth mother gave her up because of her arm." He paused, the word arm catching slightly. "She's old enough now to understand the concept of shame, even if she can't name it. And she's starting to suspect not the facts but the emotional shape of what happened. The other day she asked me if her birth mother was afraid of her. I didn't know how to answer. I still don't." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and looked at me with an intensity that dissolved all the protective distance I'd been maintaining. "I need you to understand something, George. We love Sophie more than we knew we were capable of loving anyone, but we are running out of time. The lies by omission we've told to keep this family intact are going to collapse, and when they do, Sophie is the one who will suffer most. Unless someone steps in and tells the truth in a way that includes her, that makes her part of the decision instead of the victim of it." He stood up, walked to a small desk in the corner of the room, and returned with an envelope. Yellowed at the edges, the same pale pink as the birthday card I'd found in drawer. He placed it on the table between us with the gentleness of someone setting down a sacred object. "Gave this to us 5 years ago," he said, "before she and James were even engaged. She came to visit Sophie, one of the supervised visits we allowed under the pretense of being family friends, and she handed Helen this letter. She said it was for Sophie when Sophie was old enough. She said it explained everything, who she was, why she made the choice she made, what she hoped for. It's the one true thing has ever written to her daughter, and we've been holding on to it, not knowing when or if we should deliver it. I stared at the envelope, my daughter's handwriting on the front, for Sophie when you're ready. Today, when you called, continued, Helen and I talked. We realized that we've been gatekeeping a truth that doesn't belong to us. This letter is Sophie's birthright. But before we give it to her, before we detonate everything this fragile, secret-stitched family has been pretending to be, we need to know. Are you going to help us rebuild whatever comes next? Or are you going to let it fall on Sophie alone? The question sat on the table between us, heavier than the envelope. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear Sophie's voice, light and unguarded, asking Helen if she could have a snack. My granddaughter, alive, 9 years old, and only now being introduced to me by the people who had kept her hidden for so long that the hiding had become a life. I looked at the letter, and I knew that whatever I said next was going to determine whether this family healed or shattered. I told Hale that I would do whatever it took to protect Sophie. I told him I would stand beside him and Helen when the truth came out, that I would face my daughter and my son-in-law and whatever wreckage followed. But I also told him something I think he already knew but needed to hear from another man who loved that little girl. I told him the letter on the table between us was not his to hold anymore. We've all been gatekeeping something we had no right to keep, I said. Has been gatekeeping the truth from James. You and Helen have been gatekeeping that letter from Sophie. I have been gatekeeping my own ignorance, hiding behind the excuse that my daughter didn't want me to know. And every single gate has been built in the name of love, and every single one has made things worse. Nodded slowly. He was a man who had spent 9 years constructing a careful life around a borrowed child, and I was asking him to tear down the scaffolding. He didn't argue. He just looked tired, the way men look when relief and grief arrive at the same moment and neither one announces itself first. That evening, I drove back to Virginia with the letter on the passenger seat, handwriting on the envelope catching the fading light. I didn't open it. It wasn't mine to open, but I knew that whatever was inside was going to be the most honest thing my daughter had ever said to anyone, and that it had been sitting in a drawer in Mount Airy while she sat across dinner tables from her own child and pretended to be nothing more than a family friend. When I got home, I called and asked her to come over the next morning. I told her we needed to continue the conversation we'd started. She agreed, her voice subdued but not resistant. She was past resistance now. The wall had already fallen and we were both standing in the rubble trying to figure out what was salvageable. She arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, dressed for a Sunday even though it was a Monday. I think people put on their best clothes for hard conversations the way soldiers put on armor. We sat in my living room, and I placed the envelope on the coffee table between us. The same envelope she had handed to Helen Hale 5 years earlier. The same words she had written to a daughter who didn't know her name. Stared at it. Her face went pale, then flushed, then settled into something I can only describe as resignation. The final surrender of a secret that had exhausted her. Helen gave that to you, she said. It wasn't a question. Helen's husband gave it to me, but it doesn't matter who handed it over. The point is that it was never delivered. Sophie has never read it. She doesn't know who you are. She doesn't know that the woman who visits twice a year and brings her birthday presents and listens to her talk about school is her birth mother. She thinks you're a family friend who happens to be married to her uncle. Closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek and she let it. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't hide. Why didn't they give it to her? She whispered. Because they were afraid. The same reason you didn't tell James. The same reason you didn't tell me. Fear has been running this family for 9 years, sweetheart, and I think it's time we stopped letting it. She opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a teenager caught in a lie. Not defiance, Not anger, something more fragile. The look of someone who has been holding their breath underwater and is being offered a hand to the surface. "I want to tell you everything," she said. "Things I didn't tell you on Sunday, things I've never told anyone. You deserve to know, and I need someone to know." And so she told me. She told me about the hours after Sophie's birth, when the nurses brought the lactation consultant to her room, and the consultant took one look at Sophie's arm, and her professional smile flickered, just for a moment, just long enough for to see it, and how that moment confirmed every fear she'd been carrying through 9 months of pregnancy. She told me about the social worker who had been gentle but insistent, laying out the adoption options with the practiced compassion of someone who had done it 100 times before. She told me how she signed the papers at 4 in the morning, alone, still bleeding, still swollen with the evidence of what her body had just done, while Sophie slept in the nursery 1 floor below. She told me how she walked out of the hospital into a gray Richmond dawn and sat in her car in the parking garage and screamed into the steering wheel until her voice gave out. "I told myself I was being brave," she said. "I told myself I was giving her a better life with people who wouldn't flinch when they saw her. I told myself I was protecting her from a mother who was already broken, who was already ashamed, who had already failed her in the very first moment of her life." And maybe some of that was true, but the part I didn't admit, the part I have never admitted until this exact moment, is that I was also protecting myself. I couldn't bear the looks. I couldn't bear the questions. I couldn't bear being the mother of a child who was different, because I wasn't strong enough to be different with her. She stopped, her chest heaving, the words having come out in a rush that left her breathless. I reached across the coffee table and took her hand. She held on so tightly my knuckles ached. "Then I met James," she continued, "and I didn't tell him either. Not on the first date, not on the 10th, not before we got married. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. But there's never a right moment to tell the man you love that you gave away a child he doesn't know exists. There's never a right moment to tell him that the child is being raised by his own parents. And so I let the wrong moments pile up until they became a marriage." I asked her the question I had been dreading since our conversation on Sunday. "Does James know anything at all, any part of it?" "No," she said. "He knows I had a difficult year before I moved back to Virginia. He knows I don't like to talk about it, but he doesn't know about the pregnancy. He doesn't know about Sophie. He doesn't know that his parents are raising his wife's daughter as their own. And the longer I wait, the worse it gets. Every day I don't tell him is another day I'm lying. And I'm so tired of lying, Dad. I'm so tired." I looked at her, my daughter, the woman I had raised and loved and apparently failed in ways I was only beginning to understand. And I realized that what she needed from me wasn't judgment. It was a plan. "James needs to know," I said, "not because I want to punish you, not because I think you deserve whatever anger he brings, but because Sophie deserves a family that isn't built on secrets. She's 9 years old. She's smart. She's asking questions. Told me that she's already wondering why her birth mother gave her up, already suspecting it has something to do with her arm. If we don't give her the truth, the full truth, delivered with love and care and the presence of everyone who loves her, she's going to fill in the gaps herself. And what she imagines will be worse than what actually happened." Nodded, her eyes still wet. "How do I tell him? How do I sit my husband down and explain that I've been lying to him for our entire marriage, that his parents have been lying to him for even longer, that the child he thinks is a distant cousin is actually his stepdaughter? How do I start that conversation?" "We start it together," I said, "you and me. And then we bring in Helen. And then we bring in James. And then when everyone who loves Sophie is standing on the same ground, we give her the letter. We let her decide how she wants to move forward, because she's the only one in this whole mess who hasn't had a choice. She's the one who was given up, the one who was kept secret, the one who has been loved by 4 adults who couldn't figure out how to love her honestly. She deserves the chance to decide what her relationship with all of us looks like going forward." That was the plan. It was simple in principle and terrifying in execution, and I believed in that moment that it was the right thing to do. But I was wrong. Not about the plan. The plan was solid. What I was wrong about was the assumption that we were the only ones keeping secrets. Because 2 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon with rain streaking the windows and my phone buzzing on the kitchen counter, I learned that the Hale family had been hiding something from us as well. Something that would change everything. The call came from, his voice was strained, the careful composure from our lunch completely gone. "George," he said, "I need you to come back down here, as soon as you can. Bring if she's willing, there's something you need to see." I asked him what it was. He wouldn't say over the phone, but the tremor in his voice told me that whatever had surfaced was bigger than the secrets we'd already unearthed. Bigger than the letter. Bigger than anything I had imagined when I first found that birthday card in my daughter's drawer. I called and told her we were going to Mount Airy. She didn't ask why. She just said she'd be ready in an hour. The drive south was quiet, both of us wrapped in our own anxieties, the Virginia countryside sliding past the windows like a film reel set to the wrong speed. I kept thinking about Sophie, about the first time I'd seen her face in that photograph on the mantelpiece, about the way she'd smiled at me, unguarded and trusting, with no idea who I was or what I represented. I thought about how the next time I saw her, everything would be different. She would know. The wall between us would be gone, and I had no way of predicting what would be left when the dust settled. We pulled up to the Hale house just after noon. The wraparound porch was empty. The dogwoods dripped with the last of the morning's rain. Helen met us at the door, her face drawn, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested she'd been crying. She led us into the living room without a word. Was already there, sitting on the sofa with a folder open on his lap, his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. He looked at me, then and the grief in his expression hit me like a wave. "Sophie's been asking questions," he said quietly. "We told you that, but we didn't tell you how far she's gone to find answers. Yesterday, while Helen was out running errands and I was in the workshop, Sophie got onto Helen's computer. She was trying to find information about her birth mother, about the adoption. She's 9 years old and she's been teaching herself to search records because no one would just tell her the truth." He paused, his jaw working. Helen sat down beside him and took his hand. "She found the adoption agency file," continued. "It was in an old email from the agency's social worker, the one who handled the placement. Helen kept it for legal reasons. Sophie opened it. She read everything. The intake forms, the medical records, and a document that we'd never shown anyone, a document from the hospital." Went rigid beside me. "What document?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reached into the folder and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a photocopy, slightly blurred, but the letterhead was unmistakable. Richmond Memorial Hospital, Department of Social Work. And at the bottom of the page, a signature. The signature of the social worker who had handled Sophie's relinquishment. When we got home, Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table with this printout in front of her, Helen said, her voice cracking. She looked at us and she said, "Nana, Pop, who is the man who signed this? Because it says here that the birth mother didn't decide on her own. It says there was a family member who helped arrange the adoption. A man." The room went completely silent. Took the paper from hand, her eyes scanning the text. I watched her face as she read, and I saw something I had never seen in my daughter before. Something cold and slow and terrifying. "Dad," she said, her voice utterly flat, "it says here that my father was involved. It says you met with the social worker. It says you gave input on the adoption decision." The words didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. I had not known. I had not known anything. I opened my mouth to say that, to defend myself against an accusation so impossible it had to be a mistake. And then I stopped, because in the back of my mind, buried under 9 years of grief and distraction and the haze that came after death, a memory stirred. A phone call from Richmond. A social worker's voice, professional and careful, asking if I was George, asking if I was father, asking if I could come in and help with a difficult family situation. And I had said yes. I had driven to Richmond. I had sat in a small office with a woman whose name I couldn't now recall, and she had told me that my daughter had given birth to a child with a significant disability, that she was struggling, that she might need support in making the best decision for the child's future. She had asked for my perspective as the father, as someone who knew, as someone who could help guide her through a crisis. And I had given it. I had told the social worker that my daughter was fragile, that she'd lost her mother, that she wasn't equipped to raise a special needs child alone, that adoption might genuinely be the kindest option for everyone involved. I didn't know. I didn't know she was considering giving Sophie up. I thought I was being asked for general observations, for background, for context. I thought the decision was hers alone, but the words were in a file. They had been used, and my daughter was staring at me with an expression that contained everything I had ever feared about myself as a father. "Dad," she said again, and this time her voice broke on the word. "You knew, all this time you knew." And the worst part, the part that I will carry with me until the day I die, is that I could not tell her she was wrong. Because in some terrible, buried, half-remembered way, some version of me had been in that room with that social worker, and some version of me had said the words that helped send my granddaughter away. The truth, it turned out, was not what I had come here to uncover. It was what had been hiding inside me all along. And now that it was on the table, I had no idea whether my daughter would ever forgive me, or whether I deserved to be forgiven at all. The room did not explode. That's what I remember most clearly. In the movies, when a revelation like that lands, someone throws something. Someone storms out. Someone raises their voice to a pitch that rattles the windows. But real devastation, the kind that rearranges the architecture of a family, arrives quietly. It settles into the air like smoke and waits for you to breathe it in. Was still holding the document, her knuckles white against the paper. And Helen sat motionless on the sofa, their hands still intertwined, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of people who had been keeping secrets so long they'd forgotten what relief felt like. And I was standing in the middle of the room with my past closing its hands around my throat. "It wasn't what you think," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew how weak they sounded. The kind of thing people say when they have no defense but can't yet bring themselves to confess. "Then tell me what it was," said. Her voice had gone dangerously calm. "Tell me exactly what happened." I sat down. My legs wouldn't hold me anymore, and I told her. I told her about the phone call from the social worker, a woman named Mrs., whose voice had been so practiced and gentle that I hadn't recognized it as the instrument of bureaucracy it actually was. She said had given birth to a baby girl. She said there were medical complications. That was the phrase she used, as though Sophie's arm were a disease instead of a variation. She said my daughter was fragile, that she'd been through a traumatic delivery, that she was considering placing the child for adoption, and the agency needed family input to ensure the decision was fully informed. She asked me questions. I answered them. I said my daughter had always been sensitive. I said losing her mother had nearly broken her. I said I worried about her capacity to raise a child alone, especially a child with special needs. I didn't know she was asking for a recommendation, I said, my voice cracking on the word. I thought she was being thorough. I thought she was collecting background. I didn't know my words would end up in a file. I didn't know they would be used as justification. Stared at me for a long time, long enough that I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, long enough that Helen shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. Then she did something I did not expect. She handed the document back to and sat down beside me. "That social worker," she said quietly. "She told me my father agreed with the adoption plan. She told me he thought it was for the best. She used your words, Dad. She quoted you. And I believed her. I believed you had weighed in and decided I wasn't capable. I've spent 9 years believing you knew and approved and never said a word." "I didn't know," I said. "I swear to you, I didn't know what she was doing with what I said. I didn't know she would use me to tip the scale." Was silent for another long moment. Then she said, "I believe you, but I need you to understand something. Whether you meant to or not, your words were part of what sent Sophie away. And I have been carrying the weight of what I thought was your judgment for almost a decade. That weight shaped every decision I made after. It shaped how I told you, when I told you, why I told you. I was afraid of what you'd think, and it turns out you didn't even know what you'd done. That was the worst of it. Not that I had been malicious, but that I had been careless. That I had spoken into a situation I didn't fully understand, to a woman whose agenda I never questioned, and my carelessness had become a stone in the foundation of my daughter's deepest wound." Cleared his throat. "I think," he said slowly, "that everyone at this table has done something they didn't fully understand the consequences of. I think we've all been careless with the truth, and I think we've all been paying for it. The question now is what we do about Sophie." He was right. We could spend the rest of our lives dissecting who had failed whom and how badly, and Sophie would still be 9 years old with a drawer full of unanswered questions. The wound was open. The only thing left was to decide whether we would let it heal or let it fester. I asked if I could see Sophie, not as her grandfather, she didn't know I was her grandfather, but as a man who needed to apologize to a child he had failed before he'd even met her. Helen hesitated. She looked then at me. "She knows something is wrong," Helen said. "She's been in her room since yesterday afternoon. She won't eat. She won't talk to us. She just keeps saying she wants to know the truth, all of it, and she wants to know it now. I think we've run out of time to protect her from this." So we made a decision, the four of us, sitting in that living room with the rain starting up again outside. We would tell James first, that night. Would do it, but I would be there, and then Helen would be on the phone if he needed to speak to them. And once James knew, once he'd had time to absorb the truth about his wife and his parents and the child he'd been calling his niece, we would bring Sophie into the conversation. We would give her the letter. We would answer every question she had, honestly and completely. We would let her decide what relationship she wanted with the people who had been hiding her history from her. It was the hardest thing I have ever agreed to, and I have buried a wife. Called James and asked him to meet us at my house. She didn't explain why. She just said it was urgent, that she needed him, that she had something to tell him that should have been told years ago. His voice on the other end of the line was confused and scared, and I didn't blame him. A spouse who says they have something to tell you that should have been told years ago is delivering a message before they've even said the words. He arrived at 7 o'clock, still in his work clothes, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled from running his hands through it. Met him at the door. I stayed in the kitchen, close enough to hear, far enough to give them the illusion of privacy. She told him everything. I heard her voice rise and fall through the wall, steady at first, then cracking, then steady again. I heard the long silences where James was presumably speaking or simply absorbing. I heard my daughter say the words, "Sophie is my daughter, and your parents have been raising her, and I didn't know how to tell you." I heard James say, at one point, in a voice I will never forget, "You've been visiting your own child for 5 years and you never told me. You let me believe she was my cousin's daughter. You let me be an uncle to my own stepdaughter without even knowing it." It went on for nearly 2 hours. At one point I brought them water and saw James sitting on the couch with his head in his hands, beside him but not touching him, the distance between their bodies the exact width of the secret she had kept. Then, quietly, I heard James's voice change. It softened. It moved from shock into something that sounded almost like understanding. "My parents knew," he said. "All this time, they knew who you were and they never told me either." Everyone was trying to protect everyone else, said, and we all failed. There was another long silence. Then James said, "I want to meet her, not as my cousin's daughter. I want to meet her as who she actually is. And then I want to figure out with you what comes next." It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the door left open, and sometimes that's the most any of us can offer. The next morning, and Helen brought Sophie to my house. They had told her gently that there were people who wanted to talk to her, people who loved her, people who owed her the truth. She arrived wearing a yellow raincoat and an expression of quiet, watchful composure that broke my heart because it didn't belong on the face of a 9-year-old. We all sat in my living room, and James on one side, and Helen on the other. Sophie in the middle in my recliner, her feet not quite touching the floor, and I sat beside her, close enough to reach out if she needed me, far enough to let her breathe. Spoke first. She told Sophie who she was, not the family friend, not the visitor with birthday presents, her birth mother. She told her about the pregnancy, about how scared she'd been, about how she'd made the hardest choice of her life because she believed she wasn't strong enough to be the mother Sophie deserved. She told her about meeting James, about discovering the connection, about the 5 years of silent vigil she'd kept. I told myself I was protecting you, said, tears streaming down her face. But I think I was mostly protecting myself, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I waited this long to tell you the truth. Sophie listened without interrupting. When finished, she sat very still for a moment. Then she turned to look at me. "And you're my grandpa," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "I am, and I just found out about you. And that's my fault too in ways I'm still trying to understand. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Sophie looked around the room, at the 5 adults who had spent 9 years weaving a web around her. Then she said something that none of us expected. "Can I read the letter now, the one my mom wrote?" Hand went to her mouth. She had not known that Sophie knew about the letter, but had mentioned it and Sophie had remembered. She had been listening. She had been cataloging. This child, this remarkable, clear-eyed child, had been assembling the pieces while the rest of us were still fumbling with the box. Helen produced the envelope from her purse. She handed it to Sophie, who opened it with her one full hand and her partial one, working together with the practiced coordination of someone who had never known a different body. She pulled out the letter, unfolded it, and read. The room was silent while she read. I watched her face move through emotions I couldn't fully track, her brow furrowing, her lips pressing together, her eyes filling and then clearing. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and held it against her chest. "My mom was scared," she said, looking at. "She was scared because my arm is different. She thought people would be mean to me. She thought she couldn't protect me." "Yes," whispered. "That's what I thought, and I was wrong. I was so wrong." Sophie considered this. "People are mean sometimes," she said matter-of-factly. "Kids at school ask rude questions. Grown-ups stare. But Nana and Pop taught me that's their problem, not mine. They taught me I'm not broken. I'm just different, and different isn't bad." She looked at Helen, and something passed between them, a current of love so visible I felt like an intruder for seeing it. Then she looked back at. "I'm not mad at you," Sophie said. "I thought I would be. When I found the papers on Nana's computer, I was really mad. But then I read your letter and you said you were sorry. You said you loved me even though you didn't know how to keep me. You said you hoped someday I'd understand. And I think I do understand. A little bit. Not all the way, but a little." Cross the room then. She knelt in front of Sophie's chair and she took her daughter's hand, the left hand, the one that was full and perfect, and held it against her cheek. "Can I try again?" asked. "Can I try to be in your life, not as a visitor, not as a secret, as someone who loves you and wants to know you, however much you'll let me?" Sophie looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled. That smile, the one that was, the one that was, the one that I had seen for the first time on a photograph in a stranger's house and would now see for the rest of my life. "You can try," Sophie said, "but I have rules." We all laughed, the release of tension so sudden it was almost giddy. James, who had been silent throughout, let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since the night before. "Okay," he said, "what are the rules?" Sophie straightened up in the recliner, suddenly all business. Rule 1, no more secrets. If something is about me, I get to know. Rule 2, Nana and Pop Pop are still my Nana and Pop Pop. They raised me. That doesn't change. Rule 3, I want to spend time with my mom and my new grandpa, but not all at once. Slow. Okay, like visits first, then we'll see. She looked around the room, checking for compliance. This child who had been given up, kept secret, lied to by omission, and had emerged not broken but fiercely clear about what she deserved. Okay, I said, slow, we can do slow. That was 3 months ago. Sophie now spends every other weekend at and James's house, in a bedroom they painted yellow because she said yellow was the color of starting over. She calls Mom sometimes, and no one pushes her to choose. She calls me Grandpa George, and every time she says it, I feel something in my chest unlock that I didn't know was still closed. James is in therapy with, working through the betrayal, learning to trust the wife he loves but doesn't yet fully know. And Helen still live in Mount Airy, still have Sophie during the week, still are her Nana and Pop Pop in all the ways that matter. But now we all sit at the same table for holidays. Now the photographs on the mantelpiece include my face. Now when Sophie loses a tooth, I get the phone call. It is not a perfect ending. I don't believe in perfect endings anymore. There are still hard conversations ahead. There is still anger that surfaces without warning. There is still the complicated grief of years lost that cannot be reclaimed. But there is also Sophie, growing up in the light instead of the shadows, surrounded by 5 adults who once failed her and are now spending every day trying to deserve her. And there is a birthday card on my dresser now, a new one, drawn by Sophie herself with 9 candles on the cake and the words to Grandpa George from your favorite granddaughter. She's my only granddaughter, but that's not the point. The point is that she wrote it. The point is that she knows who she is and who I am, and she chose to write it anyway. Some families are born in hospitals, and some are born in secrets, and some are born the moment someone finally tells the truth. Ours was born on a Thursday afternoon, in the back of a dresser drawer, with a birthday card addressed to a granddaughter I never knew existed. And it is, for all its broken pieces, the most whole thing I have ever helped build. I think about that Thursday afternoon a lot now. The plumber who never showed up on time, the leak I was supposed to be fixing, the box on my daughter's dresser that was slightly ajar. I think about how close I came to never opening it, how close I came to driving home, paying the bill, and living the rest of my life without ever knowing Sophie existed. And that thought terrifies me more than any of the revelations that followed. Because it reminds me that the truth, the real truth about the people we love, is often sitting in a drawer somewhere, waiting for someone to be curious enough or careless enough or desperate enough to find it. We tell ourselves stories about why we keep secrets. We say we're protecting people. We say the timing isn't right. We say the damage that would come from telling is worse than the damage of holding it in. But what I've learned, what I'm still learning at 63 years old, is that secrets are not insulation. They're not padding between the people we love and the pain we're afraid to cause. They're architecture. They become the walls of the house, and eventually you can't find the door you came in through. Sophie taught me that. A 9-year-old with one hand and more clarity than every adult in her life combined. She taught me that the thing we were all so afraid to name, the limb difference that set this whole tragedy in motion, was never the real problem. The problem was the shame we attached to it, the silence, the assumption that different meant less, that visibility meant danger, that a child's body could be so frightening to the world that hiding her was an act of love. It wasn't love, it was fear wearing love's clothes, and fear, left alone long enough, becomes a family heirloom. It passes from parent to child to grandchild, and nobody remembers who started carrying it or why. I almost passed it to Sophie without ever meeting her. Almost passed it to James without ever telling him. The Hales almost passed it to their son without ever letting him see his own wife clearly. We were all holding onto a weight that none of us had ever agreed to carry. I called the adoption agency last month. Mrs., the social worker who took my words and used them to tip the scale, is long retired now, but I wanted someone there to know what happened. To know that their system, the one designed to help families make informed decisions, had been used to reinforce a mother's deepest shame instead of challenging it. That a father's casual observations had become official record. That a child had grown up in the space between what was true and what was documented. The woman on the phone listened quietly. She said she'd make a note in the file. I don't know if it will change anything, but I needed to say it out loud to someone that the machinery that was supposed to protect Sophie had failed her from the very first moment. Not everyone gets the ending we got. I know that. There are families that fracture and never heal. There are children given up who never find their way back. There are grandparents who die without knowing their names. There are mothers who carry the weight of relinquishment into their graves, never having said the words they needed to say. I think about them now when I'm watering my tomatoes. I think about the birthday cards that never get found, the boxes that never get opened, the secrets that outlive the people who kept them. If you're listening to this and there's something in a drawer somewhere, something you've been meaning to explain or ask or confess, I can't tell you it'll turn out like my story did. I can't promise that the people on the other side of the truth will be ready to hear it, but I can tell you this. The cost of keeping it hidden is higher than you think. It accrues interest. It compounds. And the person who ends up paying the most is usually the one you were trying to protect. Sophie started asking questions because no one was offering answers. And when she found the truth on her own, she didn't break. She made rules. She set boundaries. She looked at the 5 adults who had spent 9 years failing her, and she offered us a way forward. Not because we deserved it, but because she decided she deserved better than a family built on silence. And she was right. This story isn't really about limb differences, though I hope anyone listening who has a child with a visible difference hears this and understands that your fear is not your child's reality. Your shame is not your child's burden to carry. The world can be cruel, yes, but the cruelty is not a reason to hide. It's a reason to stand beside them visibly, loudly, without apology. This story isn't really about adoption either, though I hope anyone listening who has given up a child or been given up themselves hears this and knows that the story doesn't have to end at the relinquishment. It can be reopened. It can be rewritten. It takes more courage than anyone should have to ask for, but sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the people you find on the other side are willing to try again. This story is about what happens when a family stops running from the thing that scares them most and turns around to face it together. It's messy. It's incomplete. There are still days when James is quiet at dinner, and I know he's thinking about the years of lies. There are still nights when calls me crying because Sophie said something that reminded her of what she missed. There are still moments when I look at my granddaughter's right arm and feel a grief I can't fully explain. A grief for the years I wasn't there, for the father I wasn't, for the grandfather I almost never became. But there are also Saturdays, like last Saturday, when Sophie came over to my house and we planted tomatoes together. She used her left hand to dig the holes, and I held the seedlings, and we didn't talk about anything important. We just sat in the dirt, side by side, 2 people who found each other late but not too late. She looked at me while she was patting down the soil, and she said, "Grandpa George, do you think the tomatoes will be good this year?" I told her I thought they would, and I meant it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the keeper of a secret you didn't know how to share, or the person on the other side of one waiting to be told, I hope you'll stick around. Hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it means these stories keep getting told. Stories about real families, real failures, real repairs. Because the truth is, none of us get through this without breaking something. The question is just whether we're brave enough to pick up the pieces and start again. Thank you for listening. I'm George. This is my family, and the garden is open to everyone.